Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one's about Malachi.
I watched a movie not too long ago where the main characters, the characters who you're rooting for, just keep making the same mistakes again and again. And so the majority of the third act feels like this continuing cycle of, hey, we got free from our captors. Oh no, we made mistakes. Now we're captured again, but we got free again. And it happens so many times and it gets so laughable that eventually whoever made the movie felt like they needed to hang a lantern that is signal to the audience that like, hey, yeah, we see it too. And they actually had one of these characters say, I can't believe we got captured again. And as an audience member, you're like, yeah, well, I'm right with you. That is a lot of making the same mistake over and over again. And likewise, that's kind of how the Old Testament prophetic book Malachi feels. It's the last book of the Old Testament. I don't think Malachi is just dealing with the stuff that is happening historically in the book of Malachi. I think it's also meant to be a look back at the whole Old Testament. It's meant to be an attempt to make sense of this story that we just saw and to think through whether there's any reason to stay tuned for what's going to happen next. We don't know anything about Malachi from anywhere else in the Bible. We don't know exactly when Malachi was written, though I think there are enough clues in the text to indicate that we are probably somewhere around the very end of the lifetime of Nehemiah and Ezra. We're to a place where the temple has definitely been rebuilt and is active again, but also enough time has elapsed that people are back to not really caring about it. They've sort of had their fill. They kind of got excited back with the stuff that Zechariah was saying about like maybe we're going to have this new advent of this new kingdom, like maybe now. But then it looks like a little bit of time passed and they were like, yeah, things didn't happen quickly enough. I don't know. I'm not really into it anymore. And they go back to making the exact same mistakes that they've been making since forever and ever and ever, time immemorial. And as a viewer, as a reader, there's an exhaustion that you feel, not with the Bible. The Bible's been awesome, but with the narrative, the plot, a frustration, a heart heaviness that you feel with the main human characters who just can't seem to get out of their own way. Look, I'm not saying I would have done better. I'm 100% positive that I would have been on the side of people who were idiots and did the things that were wrong all the time throughout the Old Testament because I know myself and I tend to be an idiot and do things that don't make sense, even in the face of things that do make sense. So I get it. I have empathy for these people, but just as an objective reader stepping back from a distance, you do feel fatigue at this point. You get to a place where you no longer believe that this is going to get worked out under the parameters of this paradigm. We have tried a relationship between God and his people, wandering around out in the desert with God as their sole provider. Didn't work. They weren't up for it. We've seen an attempt at a relationship between God and his people where he's their general, leading them into battle and conquest. Didn't work. We've seen an attempt at this relationship where God uses judges to govern the people and gives them all kinds of leeway. Yeah, that really didn't work. Then we've seen kings of a unified kingdom. That didn't work. Then we tried out a relationship between God and people using separated kingdoms with two different sacrificial systems and two different sets of kings. Yeah, that didn't work. Then we tried a relationship between God and his people where there's the specter of destruction always looming. Will this make them faithful? No, that's not going to work either. Okay, well, now let's try a relationship between God and his people where they're conquered and they don't have kings anymore. And now they live as subjects in exile. Now, that didn't really work either. Well, okay, now let's see what it looks like when we have God and his people come back from exile and rebuild things and govern themselves and have a new temple and a fresh chance, but now they've learned all the lessons of the past. No, apparently what we're getting from Malachi, and indeed even Haggai and Zechariah, is that's not going to work either. There's just something fundamentally broken and wrong with humanity, with the human heart. That stain of sin and ick is just too deep. It's sunk into the pores, and humans can't seem to hold up their end of the bargain. I don't think you can uniquely single out the Jews for this. I mean, noble effort, Jewish people of the Old Testament. You got called and honored and upheld by God, but you behaved like people behave. And so it just didn't work out. And again, I keep coming back to that concept of fatigue and repetition that the reader feels at the end of all of this, but that all the more so the prophet seems to feel, that being Malachi, and even all the more so God seems to feel. So why did he do all of this? Why did he let these cycles play out that way? Well, it looks like he let them play out enough times that really everybody would have to admit, yeah, we really tried that. We definitely gave this paradigm a shot to see if we could have union between God and people can't hold up their end of the deal. Well, but the people aren't going down without a fight. And in the book of Malachi, we see a series of disputations, of arguments between God and his chosen people in Jerusalem, as he expresses what he has not liked about what they have done, and as they kind of defiantly fire back and like, well, where the heck were you? What the heck are you doing? And they accuse God of things. Malachi has the briefest, boringest, least detailed introduction to a prophet, I think, in the entire Old Testament. It goes like this: the oracle of the word of the Lord of Israel by Malachi. Yeah, that's it. No getting his lips touched by hot coals, no angels with a bunch of eyeballs and stuff, no eating flying scrolls. Just, this is the prophet and this is what happened. Whenever exactly on the timeline this occurs, what we discover as we go through these disputations, these arguments between God and his chosen people, is that the temple system is very much reestablished and God's people are taking it for granted and not particularly interested anymore. Now, this is not the first time that we've seen this disputation between God and people kind of format. We especially see it in Job and then again in Habakkuk. And over the course of these disputations, God's chosen people say, you never totally loved us. You weren't here for us. They accuse him of not punishing people who live wickedly hard enough and letting them continue to thrive and exist. They say his justice hasn't come quickly enough. They haven't seen it presently enough. And along the way, God accuses them of not caring about the temple and not upholding this place that represents the thin spot between them as humans and God as the divine being. He says you bring the worst stuff from your possessions, from your flocks, as sacrifices. You're just going through the motions. You don't give what you're supposed to give per the terms of stuff from back in Leviticus in terms of supporting the temple. That is, they don't tithe anymore. And I don't want to summarize the whole thing as a stalemate between the two parties, because it's not. The people look bad and God looks good, and there's another call to faithfulness that's present in this entire disputation section of the book. But it does sort of feel like an impasse. Like God could say this a billion more times, and things have deteriorated so much on the side of the people in the relationship that not only are they not keeping the covenant anymore, they've become defensive and cynical and unrepentant, and it just looks like this is not going anywhere. Like if the solutions to the problem of humanity that have been evident through the whole Old Testament are going to come to pass, it's not going to come to pass through this relationship in the state that it currently is in. So in light of that, toward the end of the book, God says there's going to be this one who shows up, and I'm using New Testament language here because I think it's pretty clearly talking about John the Baptist, but there's going to be this one who shows up and points the way toward the new paradigm, the fulfillment of this existing paradigm that demonstrates the inability of humanity to solve their problems or get out of their own way, and that points to God bending over backwards even further and going so far above and beyond with this character that we've been hearing about, this promised Messiah who is to come, that he's going to bend over backwards in ways that nobody could fully appreciate or anticipate through this coming Messiah. And I'm filling in a few blanks there from some other books we've looked at very recently in the Old Testament in terms of the messaging of this one who is to come. But it sure looks like this messenger of the Lord is John the Baptist. And indeed, in Matthew chapter 11, it looks like Jesus confirms that that is the case. Then at the very end of this series of disputations, God says, all right, well, I'm going to put together a book of remembrance of all of the faithful from all along the way of this convoluted, cyclical, difficult story. And that book of remembrance is reminiscent to me of the stuff that we get in Hebrews chapter 11, where we see that indeed God does remember all of these great people who believed him and trusted him in the passage that some people call the Hall of Faith. But then after this beautiful book of remembrance sequence, the Lord remembers, we get a closing word of judgment and destruction, a promise that Elijah the prophet is somehow going to come back, and that there's going to be this great and terrifying day of the Lord that won't be terrifying at all for the people who are faithful to God. And all of chapter 4, indeed all of the book of Malachi, concludes on this very open-ended note, giving the impression to the reader that there is a lot more to come. This situation is not resolved. There are all kinds of promises that are still outstanding. The Messiah is not here yet. The royal line of David has not been restored. The day of the Lord, as described here, has not yet occurred. God's business with humanity is not done. God's redemption for humanity is not done. But this paradigm that we've been looking at has been clearly weighed and clearly found wanting. It's begging to be completed, to be fulfilled. It's begging to be made right. And that's what we're going to see happen as we turn the page and we finally meet this one who has been promised to come, this great king, indeed the Messiah, the Son of God, God in the flesh, who we're going to meet some 400 years down the road in the book of Matthew. When you visualize Malachi, picture a debate. When you think about the theme of Malachi, reflect on Israel's failure, as all of humanity has failed, but also look forward to a new redemptive paradigm. If you don't have time to read the whole thing, make sure to check out the stuff about the messenger who's going to prepare a way from chapter 2, verse 17 through chapter 3, verse 4. I think that's a double level up today for both the book of Malachi and the entire Old Testament. Think about what you just did. That's incredible. And if it's had any kind of impact on you like it's had on me, then I think it's probably been really fruitful, because this trip through the Old Testament that I am wrapping up right now, right here with you at this microphone, has been maybe the most meaningful, impactful time I've ever spent with the Bible. And it's been super humbling. I kind of thought I knew this material before. I've read it a lot. I went to school for this a whole bunch. I did not know this material. And by merit of you being there and caring about this too, you have forced me to fill my days and nights and time with Old Testament scriptures that I have not thought deeply about in forever. And I have learned so much and cannot wait to just flip back to the beginning and do the whole thing again for myself. This text says the word of the Lord does not return void. And so whether you're a person who's really into this document or somebody who isn't really sure what to make of God, or maybe isn't sure that there even is a God at all, or maybe you're somebody who used to be sure of that, and then weird things happen in your faith or in church, or you get your heart broken and you're still here anyway. Like, whoever you are looking at this, the God who is held out as being behind this book says that his word does not return void. And you and I just ingested a bunch of it together. And I think this is going to change our lives in some way. And I can't wait to see what the New Testament has in store for us. I really do appreciate you. Thanks for doing this. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. See you for Matthew next time around.
This podcast is supported by many of you at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. We're grateful because it supports our family.